All right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Ben Harris. I'm the managing editor of My Jewish Learning, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this class, exploring the Beilis Affair. Hopefully, if you are logged on, that is what you are here for, because that is what you are going to get over the course of the next hour. As I'm sure many of you know, Menachem Beilis was a Ukrainian Jew who was tried on charges of ritual murder just about 100 years ago in 1911. And we have the great pleasure today of learning from Jay Beilis, who you might have gathered from his name, is the grandson of Menachem Beilis. Jay is a retired businessman living in New Jersey. And he is going to talk to us today about the history of this lesser-known incident in Jewish history and the legacy of it and what it meant for his own family. We will go for probably about 30 or 40 minutes this morning, and then we will open it up to questions. If you do have a question, I would invite you to type it in the chat. And we will also allow people, if they choose, to unmute themselves when we move to the Q&A and ask their question directly. But for now, it is my pleasure to welcome Jay Beilis, who will talk to us about the Beilis Affair. Jay, thanks for being with us today. Can you unmute yourself, Jay?
Yeah, sure, I sure did. Thank you, Mr. Harris. I appreciate this opportunity to speak to your group. It's really an honor. I hope everyone will learn something today. So what I'd like to do is to start at the end. And what I'm going to read to you are the words that are written on my grandfather's tombstone. He's buried in Queens, New York. And these, again, are the words translated from Hebrew into English. So I start at the end. It says, "Here lies in turn. Pay attention to this grave. Here lies a holy person, a chosen man. The people of the city of Kiev made him a victim, and upon all Israel spread the travail. Falsely accused him and his community of taking the blood of a Christian child as demanded by him and his faith for the festival of Passover. They bound him in chains, lowered him into a pit. Many years he did not see the light of day. On behalf of all Israel, sorry, I get emotional. On behalf of all Israel, he was harshly tortured. Pay a tribute to this pure, guiltless soul who dwells in the shadow of the Lord in the heights of heaven, until those who slumber shall awaken to life." Menachem Mendel, son of Tudia, died 24 Tammuz 5694. May his memory be an eternal blessing. May his soul be bound in the bond of life eternal. I found that rather emotional. I start with that. Now, when I give these lectures live and in person, not that this isn't live, but in front of a community, sound is erratic.
Yeah, Jay, if I could ask you, is it possible that you could maybe put that microphone that's up by your head a little bit closer to your mouth? Maybe that would help with the sound. There are some folks who are having a little trouble hearing. I see that the microphone isn't next to your mouth. Does it?
Well, the microphone is, I'm using headphones, and then of course the camera is on the top of the phone. You have to stay still to talk, so somebody has a suggestion.
I see. Okay. Well, it's possible to maybe just speak up just a little because there are some folks who are having a little bit of trouble hearing you.
Fix your screen so we can see you clearly.
Yeah.
Not Brad Pitt over here. Anyway, when I give these lectures in front of a full audience, they're generally sitting in chairs. Now, the reason why they can sit in chairs is chairs are being supported by four legs. The four legs of anti-Semitism that have gone down through the years is one is Jews were accused of killing Christ. Another one was called dual loyalties, where Jews are accused of having loyalties usually to Israel, not to their home country. A year or so ago, the last president spoke in front of a meeting of Jewish business leaders and told them that Netanyahu was their prime minister. That's an example of this dual loyalties, that these people would be more loyal to Israel than they would be to America, if that's their country. The third example is known as the Protocols of Zion, which was a forged document in the 1800s, Russian/German, which accused Jews of a worldwide conspiracy, that they were looking to rule the world through the banks. And you had the Rothschild family with the several sons that had banks through Europe. So there was not some basis for that, but that accusation went for that. And then the fourth leg of anti-Semitism is various libels that you've all mostly heard about. You've heard about Jews being accused of causing the Black Plague in the 1600s and 1500s. Then there's also the Jews were accused of poisoning wells. And then the third, there was more than a few, accused of the blood libel. Now, for 875 years, the blood libel has had only one definition, and that's that Jews were accused of eating blood for wild ritual purposes. There were since the first. Well, there were ones during the biblical times, but generally 1144 was the first acknowledged one. In I can't use the word modern times because it's 875 years ago, but it's still not biblical times. And there were roughly around about 150 of blood libels between 1144 and into like right after the Second World War. There was one, Kalisz, Poland, as if the Polish Jews didn't suffer enough. They decided to drug up again in a city in Poland called Kalisz. But there were basically 5 or 6 of the major ones beginning in 1144 in Norwich. 75 years later, there was Lincoln, the Lincoln trial. And then in 1475, there was the Simon of Trent, which is what the Cunan people seem to have latched on to as far as blood being needed. And the Cunan people with the Pizzagate, you may have heard that in the news, that made a lot of news, but they seem to focus on the 1475 trial. And then 1840 was the Damascus trial in Syria, which would make sense that the Muslim folks would focus on because, of course, it happened in Syria. Most often, which is actually kind of an error is that blood libel was associated with Passover. While a huge percentage, at least 80–90%, related to Passover, they did occur at other times of the year, like New Year's and the most recent holiday in Purim, that blood was needed for Hamantash. And I know how ridiculous that sounds, but it really was a disgusting accusation that went on through the whole through the years. And the thing with the blood libel too, it was never like a planned event. It was always a crime of opportunity. It was usually a young boy, 10, 12, that would disappear. Sometimes, in those times, the kid got lost in the forest and would show up 2–3 days later, but it didn't matter. Many Jews were killed in situations like that. There was one during the 1500s where 2 rabbis spoke to the authorities in their town that they were going to go to a regional bishop and get a letter from him to say that, look, the Jews don't do things like this. And they went off, obviously there was no cars. They went on a long journey to meet this bishop, to meet with him. And by the time they got back, the whole village had been burned at the stake or burned in a barn, but the whole village had been ready to burn it. So, I mean, it's really been outrageous situations that have occurred with this accusation. Now, in recent times, like in the last 10 to 20 years, the term blood libel, unfortunately, has evolved where a new word called modern is now being put in front of blood libel, and they call it a modern blood libel, which can mean almost anything, which is really unfortunate and tarnishes the memory of my grandfather and the other 150 ones during the year, because now, especially in Israel, I fight with people all the time, kids throwing rocks, they call it a blood libel. Last year, a Muslim kid, an Arab kid, fell down a well, and they called that a blood libel, which is not a blood libel, which had nothing to do with using the blood for any ritual purposes. And also politicians, not to mention names, but politicians have had their feelings hurt and they start calling it a blood libel, which really isn't really right, because just because your feelings are hurt, don't compare it to the people who suffered greatly through this through this time. So again, it was never a planned event. It's usually, again, a child went missing, and the folks around the time thought, and especially if it happened around the holidays, they would say, well, okay, let's drum it up, and we'll start the blood libel. So now let's talk about this case, my grandfather's case, in specifically. There was the child who was killed, Andrei Yashensky, was 13 years old at the time, but in all the papers they described him as dwarf-like. So that if he walked in front of you right now, you would think he was more like 10 years old or 11 years old, that he didn't look like a 13-year-old. And not only was he dwarf-like in size, he was also dwarf-like mentally. He wasn't, the brightest bulb in the closet, as they say. As far as this specific case, while it says it's in Kiev, it also says all the papers say it's Russia, but you can't call it Russia now, especially during these times. It really was Ukraine, but it was always referred to as the Russian blood libel. And part of the reason for that was Ukraine wasn't formally acknowledged until 10 years later. So again, all the manifests, all the paper articles will always refer to it as Russia, although, obviously we all know, especially during these days, that Kiev is in Ukraine, but there wasn't officially no Ukraine back then. So they lived in the suburbs of Kiev. My grandfather was in the Pale, where Jews weren't allowed. Jews weren't allowed to live in the area where he was. So when they came looking for a Jew, my grandfather was the only one that they could point the finger at. He was able to live in that area through, it's not what you know, it's who you know. A family by the name of Zaitsev, who was a sugar beet magnate, also had friends that had this brick factory. And they got him a job as a manager of this brick factory, and that's where he worked. And outside of near the brick factory was a set of caves, and the lore going back into the 1500s was that princes and people left their jewels upon their death in these caves. So it was a common fact for adults and especially children, and specifically boys, to go wandering around these caves, hopefully finding these hidden jewels. So the boy who was killed, Andrei Yashinsky, decided to go out for a walk one day with his friend Zerny Trevernik out for a stroll. And they went looking by these caves, and Zerny was definitely the brains of the operation, a smarter child. He picked up this stick and told Andrei that this was a magic stick, almost like a binding rod people used to try to find water. But this was a magic stick, and this stick was going to be able to find all the jewels in the caves. Now, Andrei's natural reaction, being a diminished mental intellect, said, "Okay, you had your turn with the magic stick. Now it's my turn." And he goes, "No, you go find your own magic stick." And, the young boys that they were going back and forth. And Andrei kept saying, Zerny kept saying, "No, this is my magic stick, go find your own." And then Andrei said to me, "Well, if you don't tell me where, if you don't let me use that stick, I'm going to tell the police what your mother does." And that simple statement sealed his fate, as it were. Zerny's mother was a local organizer of like a band of thieves. They did mostly fencing, but not only that, it was kind of like their version of Bonnie and Clyde with a heavy accent on Jew hating. So Andrei said, "I'm going to tell the police what your mother does." Although the mother had been arrested several times. 30 years earlier, she had thrown acid in her husband's eyes, and then he actually forgave her for this outrageous act. And her name was Vera. Vera was the mother, and she decided, well, we can't let this happen. And she had arranged for her posse, as it were, to kill young Andrei. The body was found 8 days later in these caves, totally void of blood, which makes sense as far as the blood libel accusation, because the blood would be needed for these ritual purposes. And that's basically what started the accusation. 8 days later, at the funeral on March 20th, a young reactionary. Now, this is not communist. This is our time. So a young reaction by the name of Gulag started handing out these flyers about like how the Jews, although he actually used the word kikes, or their version of kikes, were about to killed young Andrei for needing for the blood for Passover, because it was around the time of Passover. And immediately the authorities put on a what they call the Sherlock Holmes of Russia, this Detective Krafsky, who immediately realized that it was this Vera Chernat, the woman who was responsible for the murder. And he worked on his case, and he presented the fact, I'm talking too fast, that he prevented, yeah, well, I got excited about the story, so sorry about that. I'll try to slow down. So he assembled his case against Vera, and it was an ironclad case, but of course it did not go the way the authorities wanted. The authorities wanted to push it in the direction of a blood libel. So the detective was fired. In fact, actually, he was in prison for a short time, and he lost his job. And the months went by, and the months went by from March into July, and at July 22nd, 23rd. Of course, there's a big difference here with the calendar. The calendar dates don't always jive, but it's about July 22nd, or July 23rd, that the Cossacks, as it were, came to my grandfather's house, pre-born, and woke him up and told him that he was going to be arrested, and came to and took him off to the prison. Didn't tell him what he was going to be charged with. Right, that's right, John. Yes, it's about right. Yeah, that's correct. And so he was right. So the leaflets. And so he was in prison from July 23rd. In American law, Sixth Amendment, you need to be indicted within 48 hours. But the months again lagged on, and he didn't receive his indictment until the following February. So he was in prison for 8 or 9 months before he even received an indictment, that he was able to see his lawyers even, which is actually part of the story. And there was great people were the papers were covered. Papers from all over the world were covering it at the time. Now, like for a paper, you open up a paper, there's a business section, sports section. At that time, there was what they called cable of Europe. That was all the news that was coming from Europe, and it was covered quite a bit from the from Europe for the trial at the time. It was very, very big. It was very big stories. People spoke out. There were rallies in Chicago where Booker T. Washington and the suffragette lady did a big had in Chicago had organizations and speeches where they were defending my grandfather. People coming out, even the churches were coming out to say that this never happened. Jews don't do things like this. And actually, in the summer of 2012, I believe, there was the 300th anniversary of the Romanov Empire, and they said that they were going to release various quote unquote political prisoners to as a gesture for the 300th anniversary. And word got to my grandfather that they may actually release him from prison. And he said no. He says, I want to stay in prison until I get a fair trial. So he remained in prison until it was not definite that they would release him, but that there was a chance that they might release him on this anniversary. And he said no. He says he insists that he would stay in prison until he actually got a fair trial, because he believed he was innocent of all of these trials, of all of these charges, as it were. So now the years went by, and the trial began on September 25th, 1913, again with the calendars. And the trial lasted 6 weeks. It was covered by the press all over the world. It was covered by the Times. It was covered all through Europe. It was a pretty big story at the time. And basically, the prosecution case fell apart right from the beginning. The chief witnesses, so-called witnesses, were a couple, and they were known as the lamplighters. Their occupation, of course, this was before electric street lights, was to go down the streets with giant poles and light the street lights with the oil lights with the flame, the light. So their occupation was the lamplighters, and they would that's how they were even known as the lamplighters. And they told the police that they saw a man come from the factory with a black beard and a black coat with like in the mob movies, they have a body wrapped up in a blanket or a sheet. And they saw this man walk from the factory with, let's say, a carpet with it looked like a body that was inside, away from the factory and towards the caves, as it were. But once they were put under oath, their whole story fell apart. They said, "We don't know why we're here. We can't be bothered with this. The police gave us alcohol, got us drunk. They gave us vodka. We want to go home now. We don't know anything about the story. We didn't see anything about the story. We don't know anything." And that was their star witness, which obviously did not help the prosecution at all. Second, what you would need in a story like this, especially in a case where murder and blood's involved, you want a medical expert. The medical expert who was called in was a psychiatrist, as it were, psychologist. Psychiatrist. His name was Ivan Sikorsky. He was brought in to testify of the nature of the wounds. He got the number of the wounds wrong. He made a fool of himself. And the name Sikorsky may mean something, it may not mean anything to you. But his son was Ivan Sikorsky, who was basically known as the father of the modern helicopter. Is obviously several generations now, long gone now. But he was known as the father of the modern helicopter. And in the late 20s, one of his best friends was Lindbergh, who was a notorious Jew hater himself. So, you get to see what kind of company these people kept in. I mean, they all have their own agenda, and their agenda was to hate Jews, as it were. And the third, what you would need would be a witness who would be an expert on the Talmud. And they have really had trouble finding anybody who was an expert on the Talmud that was willing to testify as that Jews would do this. So they found basically they call it the frat priest by the name of Priantis, who was just, besides being just ignorant of the Talmud, as it was really not a nice guy. He was even actually sent to faraway lands and out of Russia, but was brought back for this trial. But he too made a total fool of himself. And I'm just going to read the passage from one of the lawyers. His name is Tranianthius. And he says, "You presented a long statement with imaginary proofs from the Talmud and other books that Jews required blood for Passover. But he's a born and ignoramus. He was asked when Mrs. Baba Batra lived and didn't know the answer. But two Christian professors can testify to the fact that no woman by that name ever lived. The plain sense of the words is the last gate. It's part of the Talmud. In the Talmud, there are a tractate devoted to a specific set of laws that is divided into 3 volumes. The last is known as Baba Batra. So asking this, so-called expert on the Talmud, when did Mrs. Baba Batra live, really evoked a lot of laughter from the audience, because he made a total fool of himself. And as it says here, anyone who doesn't know the meaning of these 2 words, which every Jewish child knows, and insists on citing them in a document despite his ignorance, is a fraud." The trial went on. The jury was basically stacked against him. It was carefully picked that they found basically there was a half a dozen common peasants, but there was also stacked with their version of the Ku Klux Klan, which is the Black Hundreds, which was a notoriously anti-Semitic group, which they put 6 of them on the juries, what they call stacking the jury, and that would be the jury against them. And the defense put on various claims. They brought in various experts about their Jews to do things like this. And they brought in a Rabbi Mazza from Moscow, who was the number 1 rabbi in Moscow, universally respected all over the world. And he gave an almost day-long speech about that Jews don't do things like this. It's ridiculous, and there's no credibility behind this. Now, the name Mazza, Rabbi Mazza, would probably not be familiar to any of you, but not to drop names, but his nephew was the famous comedian Jackie Mason, who was a name you, I'm sure, know. And I tried to reach out to Jackie while he was still alive on Twitter, and he never responded. But I spoke to his niece, and his niece said for sure that Rabbi Mazza was Jackie's uncle. Not to drop names, but there's interesting things like this, came out during the story. And again, how the jury was basically stacked against him. And after the jury heard all of this testimony, the judge, by the name of Bolderov, another notorious anti-Semite, gave what they call a charge. It's common in all court cases. A charge to the jury, and the charge was: you've heard all of this evidence for the past 6 months. All you need to ignore everything you've just heard for the last 6 months. All you need to know is that a Christian child is dead and a Jew has been accused of killing the child. That was the charge that the judge, this esteemed judge, as it were, gave to the jury. I mean, that's pretty ridiculous to tell a jury something like that, to ignore all the evidence. But such is the times. Even after all of that, even though the prosecution made a fool of themselves, they still didn't know, especially with that stacked jury, whether there would be a verdict against my grandfather. The jury went out, the jury came back, the foreman came in, and under our law, and I mean America, they'll send the jury back until the verdict is 12-0. Otherwise, it's just a mistrial. In Russia, if the jury determined that it was 6-6, the person was let free. So the Black Hundreds, the prosecution, as it were, knew they had their 6 votes. Those guys were going to vote against my grandfather because they just hate Jews. So the issue was to try to get the 6 peasants, limited knowledge, to vote that way. And almost a scene out of a movie, which I feel this would make a great movie, except no one would believe it. That's my latest thing in life, to try to get a movie made, but it's been on deaf ears. It came down to where it was going to be 6-6. It was going to actually be 7-5. And one of the peasants got up and said, I heard the evidence. I cannot send this mail to the gallows, as it would have been. I am voting not guilty. So the final determination was that, again, there were 6, the 6 Black Hundreds, as it were, and the 6 peasants voted not guilty. However, there were 2 accusations or indictments in this case. One, that a blood libel had occurred. And second, did my grandfather murder the child? So first, the foreman read guilty. The blood libel, after all of that, blood libel had occurred. Now, could you imagine what went through my grandfather's head in those 10, 15 seconds until the foreman read whether my grandfather was innocent or guilty? He most assuredly must have thought that if they were going to determine that there was a blood libel had occurred, that my grandfather did it. But nope, he said not guilty. There were Jews in the upper balcony, as it were, in the courtroom that were screaming in celebration. He was acquitted. Bolderov, the anti-Semitic judge, said to him, "You're not guilty. You're a free man. You can go. However, I don't believe the streets are very safe, and I advise you to stay in prison one more night, just for precaution." He agreed. Mendel agreed. He stayed in the prison one night. He went back home the next day. They put a colonel, as it were, of the police outside of his door to guard him. There were huge throngs of people that went to visit him, to give celebration, Jews and non-Jews. Because as I like to say, this really isn't an anti-Christian story. 4 of his 5 lawyers were Christian. The jury was all Christian. There were priests all over the world, Christians, ministers that spoke out in his defense to say Jews don't do this. So I always like to throw in there that people shouldn't think this is an anti-Christian story, which it's not. He got a lot. In his autobiography, which he wrote 95 years ago, and it was translated. He wrote in there how much he appreciated how these lawyers, and 4 of the 5 were Christian, spoke out on his behalf, and how the Christians that testified during the trial, because the murder happened on a Saturday, on Shabbos, as it were. And going back a generation before him, the family was religious. He was, quasi-religious. I mean, I still have his tallis. I mean, he observed the holidays, but he worked on Shabbos. That's when the murder happened. And that was a big part of his alibi, is that people testified that they saw him at his desk. Their bill of ladings with his hand signature, with timestamps. The prosecution said, well, he could have slipped out for 20 minutes, killed a kid. But, there were people that testified in his behalf, the co-workers. He was known as our little Mendel. They found one man who decided, one of the workers who decided to testify against him. And then on the court, under cross-examination, he said, well, actually, I didn't see any of that. I don't know anything. Mendel accused me of stealing something from the factory a few years later, and I did time in prison, but I was guilty. He was not wrong in reporting me. So, now I'm getting a little bit back into the trial. Sorry about that. But anyway, this colonel was given the assignment to guard him, and in the book he said he thought that he'd be able to retire a little early because of all the bribes he was taking from people who wanted to get into the line to go see my grandfather, to cut in the line as it were, a little bit of humor out of it. And 2 weeks or so after my grandfather was released, and none other than the famous Sholem Aleichem, the most famous Yiddish writer ever, went to visit him at his house, and he told him the weight of 12 million Jews were on his shoulders for every day that he was in prison. And we know what happened to half of them. So this is so. So after that, he naturally he couldn't stay in Kiev, in that area. These black hundreds, and to this day they cite that blood libel had occurred. My grandfather didn't do it, but a blood libel did occur, and that really wasn't safe for him. So this was at the end of October 28th, the verdict was read. In February, a couple of months later, he decided to move to what he called the land of Israel. 1914, so there was no Israel, whatever you want to call it, but that's what he called the land of Israel. And he lived there landed in Haifa. When the family went through Europe, they reached the northern city of Trieste in Italy, and there were 20,000 people waiting for him. So again, even though the story is not well known now, the story was very well known back there. Back then, the 20,000 people were waiting in the city, 1,000 miles away from Kiev, or whatever the distance was to greet him. And he made his way down through Italy, through the Mediterranean, and landed in Haifa. And they lived in Pet Tikva, which is a suburb in that area around Tel Aviv. They lived in Petah Tikva. There are streets named after us in Petah Tikva. The streets are named after us in Jerusalem and several other cities as well. And he lived there from 1914, but a lot of promises, including from the Rothschild family, buying a house, and he lived comfortably, and all of that actually disappeared. And then in 1921, he decided he was going to come to America, like I'm sure most of their ancestors did. And he came to America in 1921, and then again, like most of the families did, he sent, a year or so later, he sent for his family, which at that time consisted of my grandmother and the 5 children. And he came to America. They came to America the next year, about 1922. And obviously, 30 months in a Russian prison, a real hellhole, wasn't going to be the best for his health. So he ended up with a rheumatic heart, what a defective heart as it were. And he ended up going up to, I don't know how many New Yorkers there are out there, but up in Sarasota Springs in New York, they were known as these mineral springs that people went to recuperate or feel better, make them feel better. And one of his trips up there in 1934, around actually our New Year's, July 4th, he passed away at the age of 60. And then several days later, he had his services, the Eldridge Shul in the Lower East Side. and 4,000 people showed up for his funeral. They had to call in extra police because the crowds went out into the streets. And again, this is 20 years after the trial, still 4,000 people who were obviously alive and remember what it is and how they affected him. Affected them. Showed up for my grandfather's services. While he was in America, he wrote his autobiography. Again, I just showed it to you. He wrote it in Yiddish. It was translated into English, actually translated into Russian as well. And then 10 years ago, we two of my friends, both attorneys, we published the book in case people wanted to see the book. I've had a podcast made, and hopefully this will also add to the availability to people understand it, to know this story a little bit better. And lastly, what I like to just get into is legacy. What does it mean, and what does the story have as far as an impact? In the early 60s, my family used to go to. In the early 60s, I could do this without reading this part. In the early 60s, my family used to go up to what they used to call the bungalow colonies up in New York. Their families would go there. The fathers would come up on the weekend. This was 1962, 1963. This was 50 years after the trial. And when word got around that specifically my grandfather was there, people would come from all over, bring all sorts of kinds of trinkets and gifts and walk up. I mean, I have this image, even though it's 50 years later, 60 years later now, of these people walking up the grasses, towards our bungalow, as it were, tapping on the door, saying, is it really true? Is that really you? My father said, well, it's not me, it's my father. And they would say that they left. Again, this is 50 years after the trial, so a lot of them were there during the trial, but their families left all over Europe, not just Kiev, Lithuania. They'd run down the cities, and they left after the trial. Just like Jews left Germany and Austria after Kristallnacht, Jews left all over Europe after the trial. They saw it as a warning that they better get out. And if they didn't get out, they could have been caught up with the show later on. And that's how grateful they were to my father that his father, my grandfather, suffered so dearly, the 30 months in prison, the sacrifices he made, and that these people left again all these different areas at that time that would have saved them. Now fast forward to 1984, a movie came out by the name of Shoah. It was an 8-hour movie, long movie. About the Holocaust, and this man, Claude Lanzmann, who just recently died a few years ago, was there. I went to see the movie on Broadway in New York City. Carl Lanzmann was there, and I was 30. I was 30 at the time, and I was the youngest person there by 40 years. And this little lady walks up to me, and she says, "Oh, did you lose, family in the Holocaust?" And I said, "Well, nobody really super close." I said, "But this is who my grandfather was." And she goes, "No, I don't know who the name is, but I'm having one of my friends is stopping by. We're going to watch the movie. Maybe he knows." And the friend comes over. I introduced me. She goes, "Wow, that's really you." I said, "No, again, it's not me. It's my grandfather." So now the two of us. I walk into the movie theater with my two best friends, and we're watching the movie, and I hear all this whispering around. Sorry, somebody just gets emotional. I hear all this whispering around me, and I don't know if you remember the movie show. It was an 8-hour movie, and they broke it into 2 parts. So at the end of the first part, after the first hour, the lights come on, and I turn around, and I got 40 sets of eyes looking at me. Because while the movie was going on, the people next to him were, hitting each other. And this is the whispering that I was heard was, "Here's Beilis," and again, it's my grandfather. I never tried to say that I am, but my grandfather was. And again, the same thing. They all came up to me. And they were, and again, this is now 70 years after the trial. So if they were really, into their 80s or 90, and there were quite a few people there, they remember the trial. They were there. They remember the trial, and they would say the same things that they said then, that their families left all of these different countries. Now, fast forward, and this will be the end of it. Again, my grandfather had his services at the Eldridge Street Synagogue. And I was invited to go there for the 125th anniversary 20-something years ago. And we all got a chance to speak. And I got up and I gave this little speech, not as long as today. And there was a esteemed historian who's like, oh, that's all just like, family, law from there's no evidence that anybody ever left. And that's just, charm that the family's trying to like latch on to. I mean, it was really like almost denigrating towards me. Really, it was really being pretty obnoxious until it was interesting that I'll never forget this, like 19-year-old girl stood up and she goes, I don't know what you're talking about, sir, but my grandparents told us they left all over Europe after the trial. So I don't know why you would say something like that. And a half a dozen other people in the audience got up and basically shouted the guy down too, saying, we don't know what in the world you're talking about. Our family left all these different countries. Our family left all the different countries after the trial. So that's basically, it's about 40 minutes, Mr. Harris. That's basically that's basically the story.
Thank you so much, Jay. Thank you for sharing this really interesting glimpse of an important episode in Jewish history. We're going to aim to conclude today, everyone, promptly at 11, but we have a little less than 20 minutes. We can take some questions. If you want to pop them in the chat, you are welcome to do that. If you want to ask Jay directly, you can use the raise your hand function on YouTube, and I will unmute you and allow you to ask him.
Okay, I just want to make the point that I'm not a professional speaker. I mean, I don't do this for a living, so I know there's a lot of rough edges and there are a lot of complaints about talking, too fast or whatever. But again, I'm not a professional speaker. It's just something that's in my heart with my family. So please, don't throw in tomatoes. I try my best, and I think you learned a little bit, today that maybe you didn't know, a few days ago.
We had a couple of questions that already came through while we're waiting to see if anybody else has some. Let me just put one or two to you that came in already. Jay, Linda wants to know what, if anything, Mendel's children said about their father, not just about the trial, but about him as a father and as a person.
Okay, well, my father died suddenly. I was 27. I mean, I wish I could have really interviewed him a lot better, a lot more exclusive, but I really never got the chance. Now, he had my Aunt Rachel, the youngest child was a twin, and her twin brother died pretty much at birth. And Rachel died about 11 years ago, at the tender age of 102. I used to tell her that, she lived a life for both of us. And she was interviewed by a man who wanted to make a documentary, and he won't give me he died now, but the company won't give me the tapes and all of that. But until the last breath at 102, and she was pretty lucid until well over 100. She, even on her bed lying in the nursing home, she would say, I don't know why he said that the Jews don't do this. Why did they keep saying that, the Jews did things like this, Jews don't do things like this. And until basically her last breath, she would say that. I didn't really never got to speak a lot about it. I was 27 when my father died. He didn't really want to talk about it all that much. Obviously I know the story. I relate to you about the bungalow colonies. I know who I was, and occasionally people would know. My mother, my mother used to sing in the workman circle chorus, and which was filled with a lot of Holocaust survivors. And when they found out who the father-in-law was, and I knew a lot of these women, so I knew what the significance was as far as my grandfather. But yeah, it would have been great to have interviewed my father more formally about it. But that's the way it is. I have to go by what the book was. What was in the autobiography. And then 10 years ago was the 100th anniversary of my grandfather's trial, and two men wrote a book, and one was Ed Levin, and he actually went to, for the first time since the war fell down, he was able to go to Kiev and go through all the papers and everything. He wrote the definitive work on my book. It increased my knowledge of the story because he was able to go through all the papers and all the court documents, and he was able to write the definitive work on this. But my grandfather's autobiography is a great starter too. It's a quick read except for all the Russian names. It's a fascinating story. As I said, I'd love to get it made into a movie, but it's not so easy. And I'm not sure people have to put a disclaimer to say all of this happened, because people won't believe it actually happened. Like the charge from the judge. Oh, and by the way, actually, after the revolution, basically everybody involved in this case was murdered, including the judge, the prosecutors. They were all murdered by the Bolsheviks. Next one, please.
Thanks, Jay. Janine actually has her hand up. Janine, did you want to ask Jay your question? You can unmute if you like.
Yes. Thank you very much for your talk and all that you do. And I think it would make a great movie. It's my understanding, maybe it's my feeling, but it's my understanding that there are authorities that make Jews the scapegoat, the other, so that kind of divert the public from maybe other things that are going on. Do you think that was a factor here?
Oh, Janine, what a beautiful question, because you're also right. The Tsar totally supported it. I mean, the Tsar's power, again, the Russian Revolution happened in 1917, not that I'm an expert on it, but it didn't happen overnight. It was built over a number of years, and part of it was he felt that the Jews were becoming too powerful. He was losing his strength over the people. And yes, it was an enormous factor. Again, the Tsar was 100% up in St. Petersburg, 100% behind this. No, definitely, that's an excellent question, Ms. Mayor. Absolutely, the Tsar was totally behind it. And yeah, this was that again. Otherwise, it would have just been a local bloodline, and the whole world knew about it at this time. Yeah, that's a very good question, actually, and a point I actually should have made. But thank you, Ms. Mark. That's an excellent question. Because yeah, absolutely, the whole world knew about it. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks. Leslie, did you want to ask Jay your question?
Yes, I wanted him to comment on the movie made with Alan Bates about the Beilis trial.
Oh boy. Okay. See. All right. Okay. Well. Okay. I'll answer the question. Okay. So my grandfather wrote his autobiography in Yiddish in 1926. Under copyright laws, you were able to have a copyright on your book. I believe it was 17 years, renewable once automatically. In 1967, 1968. A well-known, one of the great, I hate to use the word great, writers by the name of Bernard Malamud came out with a book called The Fixer, in which he plagiarized significant parts of my grandfather's book. It was just so obvious. In one case in my grandfather's book, he wrote about how the prison guards would come to his prison cell, and there were 13 locks on the prison door, and he changed it that there were 11 locks on the prison door. There was another example in my grandfather's book where they ate out of a common pail, and how the other prisoners rejoiced that they found a mouse in the pail where they were going to eat out of. They rejoiced that there was a mouse. That's how bad times were. And my grandfather wrote that it was half a mouse, and Malamud wrote that it was a quarter of a mouse. I mean, but what happened was my father really hated Malamud for what he did, because he wrote in The Fixer. The Fixer came before the movie. The movie was made. It was generally panned, even though Alan Bates, Dirk Wagner, John Frankenheimer was the director. I mean, a lot of big people were involved, but it was generally panned as a really bad movie. But he won, the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Review, for stealing my grandfather's words and his thoughts. I mean, it's just so obvious. And in our book, part of the at the back, we give 3 dozen examples about what Malamud did. But a lot of it's sounds like I'm crying, sour grapes and stuff. So in the lecture proper, I like to just stick with what the lecture is. But it's a fair question, and it's really a crime what he did. And he really he made it. He wrote in the book that my grandmother ran around with other men when my grandfather was in prison. And they write it off. They write it off as being it's a novel. And when the book came out, I was 14, and I was trying to explain to my father, it was a novel, and I never saw my father mad. But in just a rage, it was like, go out and play with your friends. You don't know what you're talking about. Look what he wrote about my mother. And I'm like, and about the family in general. I was 11 years old. I was a little kid. I said, yeah, but it's a novel. You have leeway in writing a novel. But anyway, that's pretty much what I have to say about that.
Thanks, Jay. I'm gonna because they're sort of on similar topic. Just in the interest of time, we have a couple of people who are asking about additional resources. To know if there was a list of books about this part of history that you could share. Debbie Myers asked about a book that she heard about from her grandmother in Lithuania, who said that there were a book of pictures that was issued at the time that was collected later but later lost. Do you know anything about that? And a third person asked about a podcast that you mentioned, which I actually didn't hear you mention a podcast, so maybe that was an error. But maybe you could take all those together.
Yes, we did. I guess the best way to do it is everybody is on Twitter. I could point you towards Twitter, or if you want, I can read out my email. And if you really want to email me, I could send you the podcast. And so it's really not much different than what we've just spoke about today. I mean, there's no Q&A because it's a podcast. And if you think I'm talking fast now, I really was talking fast then. So you have to maybe go back a little bit on the tape because I really did fly through it. But I get caught up in the story and I get anxious to tell it. And, there's a lot to tell. There's a lot I left out. So sorry about talking about that. I guess should I give my email or they contact you, or you can look me up on Twitter if anybody's on Twitter. I'm glad we have.
I think
the book.
I think, Jay, if you want to share a link, the best thing to do is to put that in the chat if you have a second.
Okay. Should I put my email in there, or is that just being like...
That's up to you, or you can just put a link to your Twitter account or to the podcast itself, whatever you think is better.
Okay. I guess I should have come up with the podcast.
We also have Janet Potter saying in the chat that she has every book ever written on this topic. But if there's a list that people want to share of resources, we have a couple more minutes so we can drop those in the chat. Jay, did you have anything to say about this question about the book in Lithuania of photographs that was collected but later lost that Debbie was asking about?
No, it's new to me. I've never heard of. No, I don't know anything about it. I mean, there's pictures in the book, and in all of the books, there's pictures of the trial. The jury, my grandfather, the people that are involved, Kraskowski, the picture of the defense attorneys and the prosecuting attorneys, but a picture book, that's all new to me.
Okay. I think we have one more question. This might be the last one from Sheila, who wanted to know if 3 of Mendel's daughters converted to Christianity, wouldn't that have been something positive that could have been used in his defense at the trial? You have any thoughts on that?
I don't know. Wait, what's the question? The question is that my aunts converted to Christianity?
Well, that is the question. I also didn't hear you say that, so maybe Sheila misheard. Was that an error?
No, nobody would convert. Nobody would convert in my family. No, he had 2 daughters. Again, Rachel lived to 102. She was Jewish until her last breath, and Miriam died of leukemia in the 50s. She was about 40 years old. No, that's what I don't understand. People think that she was.
Yeah, that might have just been an error. Okay, so thank you for clarifying that. And we just had one more question come in the chat, and maybe this will just be the last one from Sandra, is asking about comparisons to the way Mendel's trial was handled versus how the Dreyfus Affair was handled. Do you have any?
Well, the thing with Dreyfus, and again, this is why my grandfather's story has been end up in the dustbins of history, is that, and I actually reached out many years ago, I guess maybe even naively, about doing something on my grandfather, and they said, well, what do you have? And I said, well, I really don't have anything. And and they said, well, we have so much. We got placards and everything about Dreyfus. He was well known, but Dreyfus. The big thing with Dreyfus, again, it was further west in a more enlightened area in France. But the key with Dreyfus is that he had Emile Zola, who really told the story to the whole world. My grandfather didn't have any actual one person at that time. Plus, my grandfather wanted to return back to his life. He didn't want to become a celebrity. I mean, he was, even in America, he did a tour he went to Ohio, and when none other than Manischewitz himself from the wine found out, invited him to a Seder because he wanted to come, but he just, for the sake of the children, he wanted to just go back to his normal life. I'm going to print in. I think the easiest way is for me to just print in my email. I doubt that nobody here is going to hack my account. I don't, if anybody wants to talk to me, I think maybe that's the easiest way, and I can give them whatever.
That sounds like a good plan. So we'll hang for just another minute for you to be able to share that email with everyone. And I will just, there it is. There's Jay's email if someone wants to get in touch with him for the podcast or to learn anything more. There it is. That will not be there for much longer. So folks, if you want to grab that and copy down that email.
And I'm going to do my, I can do the Twitter quickly too.
So we have a Twitter link forthcoming. And I will just thank Jay for your time this morning and for sharing this really interesting information with all of us. And I want to thank you all for tuning in and joining us this morning. And we hope to see
a lot of great questions are coming in. Too bad we can't stay longer. I can answer these questions. But I guess if they contact me, somebody's asking me here about the Maurice Samuels book. We met him. We actually went to his funeral, a very nice man. But again, he didn't use primary sources. The book that Ed Levin wrote 10 years ago, he went to Kiev. Maurice Samuels wrote a book basically on his own father's notes and other things that he read. But he didn't go to Kiev to get firsthand primary sources like Ed Levin did. But it's still an excellent book, and it came out the same week as it was The Fixer. So we made friends with Maurice Samuels. Again, we went to his funeral, a very nice man. While at the same time that we hated Mahler for what he did. But his book didn't sell at all. I mean, he sold 10 copies and he sold anything. Maurice Samuels. But it wasn't primary sources. The Ed Levin book is a much better source for it. But it reads like a textbook. I mean, my grandfather's book is a quick read.
Great. Thanks for taking that last one, Jay. Just to try to conclude on time, we will end it there. Thanks again to you, Jay, and thanks for everyone for being with us.
Thanks everybody showing up. This was great. I wish I could have stayed another hour answering questions. And again, I'm sorry that, as I said, I'm not a professional speaker. So if I make mistakes, I'm sorry about that.
All good. Thanks, everybody. Take care.